I just wanted to tell you about the tomb of Lazarus and the house of Mary and Martha in Bethany. Bethany, its medieval name, is today called El Azaria, or the place of Lazarus, and is situated in the West Bank. It nestles on the southeastern slopes of the Mount of Olives, about 2 miles from Jerusalem, on the road to Jericho. Bethany was the home of Lazarus and his 2 sisters, Mary and Martha. And it's here that Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead in John 11, 1 through 44. It was here that Jesus would often stop over in Luke 10, 38 through 42. And it was also in Bethany that Mary anointed the feet of Jesus in the house of Simon the leper. In Matthew 26, 1 through 13, Luke 7, 36 through 50, John 11, 1 through 44, and Mark 14, 3 through 9. Several Christian churches have existed on this site, dating back to the first one in the 4th century called the Lazarian, which was destroyed by an earthquake in the 6th century. The present yard contains a remnant of the mosaic floor of that church, and this was then followed by a larger church which stood till the age of the Crusades. In 1143, a Benedictine convent dedicated to Mary and Martha was built near the tomb of Lazarus, and today's church is dedicated to St. Lazarus and was built in 1995. Also in 1965, a Greek Orthodox church was built west of the tomb of Lazarus. The entrance to the tomb today is via a flight of 24 steps cut from the rock, leading from the street level to the tomb. One descends into a small chamber, which also serves as a place of prayer. One can see the entrance to Lazarus' tomb, which connected to his home. And when the Ottomans took over Jerusalem, they built the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and in the 16th century, they blocked the entrance. It was the Franciscans who opened the entrance to the tomb that is used today, and on the floor covering the tomb was a rock that would have been placed over, and a plaque from the first letter of St. Paul's to the Corinthians, chapters 15, 54, and 55, remind the pilgrim that death has lost its sting. And of course, I just shared that Lazarus' ossuary was discovered on the Mount of Olives on the road to Bethany in the same location as Mary and Martha were found in situ, which is the original archaeological way that they were discovered, without it having been disturbed previously. And it was incredible that Simon Peter, Simon Bar-Jonah, or Bar-Jonah, as they say in English, that his ossuary was found only 12 feet from Mary, Martha, and where Lazarus were buried. So this was on the Mount of Olives. And let me just share a little bit of information about the Mount of Olives. The mountain with olive groves east of ancient Jerusalem, adjacent to the Temple Mount, site of significant biblical events, including the triumphal entry, arrest, and ascension of the Messiah. The Mount of Olives is a single peak of a 2-mile-long ridge that borders eastern Jerusalem, forming a barrier between the city and the Judean wilderness to the east. Sometimes Mount of Olives refers to this entire range, including 2 other peaks. And most of the time, however, it refers to the highest center peak directly across from the eastern side of the Temple Mount. The mile-long Mount of Olives proper is approximately 2,700 feet above sea level, and it stands about 300 feet over the city, past the edge of the Temple Mount, where the terrain dips into the Kidron Valley. And from this perspective, the mount seems much higher than it actually is. From the top, there is an impressive panoramic view. The Dead Sea lies 15 miles to the east, beyond the Judean desert, with the mountains of Moab on the horizon. To the west lies the city of Jerusalem with the Temple Mount. The mount's height is relative to the vicinity, and its position around the city made it a natural bulwark, doubling as a watchtower against eastern invaders and a token of protection. Josephus records the distance from the mount to Jerusalem as approximately 3,300 feet, and as approximately 3,960 feet in Josephus in Jewish War 5.70. Although it is known as a mount, its scale probably does not match that of the common conception of a mountain. However, the distinction between a hill and a mountain is hazy, and the original terms, har and oros, do not necessarily denote giant projections of land. Indeed, an oros is defined as an area which is only higher than a bunyos, a minor elevation. The Mount of Olives sits on the eastern edge of a lengthy stretch of limestone soil, which gives rise to the numerous olive groves that covers its surface. The mount would probably not have been named for its olive groves if there were not noticeably more than elsewhere in the region, and the olives would have also been economically significant for Jerusalem during the Second Temple period, when they were cultivated and harvested, as it is evident in the Mishnah in Pesach 41a. Olive oil was also probably the only export from Jerusalem in the time of Jesus. And, of course, they harvested the olive oil there to light the menorah in the Holy Temple, and the light, it was never supposed to go out. So it was important for the priest to keep an eye on it and never let the flame die out, because it really is representative of God's Holy Spirit. And the Mount of Olives is first mentioned in 2 Samuel 15:30, when David flees from Jerusalem to escape Absalom's invasion. He crosses the Wadi Kidron, known as the Kidron Valley, and goes up weeping, literally the ascent of the olive trees. He reaches the summit, called the place where God is bowed down to, and meets Hushai the Archaeologist, gaining his help against Absalom. And past the summit is where David meets Ziba and turns over to him all of the Mephibosheth's belongings. And Josephus adds that when David reaches the summit, he weeps and prays when he is able to gain a broad view of the city, as if the kingdom he beholds has been lost. The Mount of Olives is also mentioned in Zechariah 14:4. The prophecy describes a time when God will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to pillage it. Half of the city will be exiled before God. Then battles the nations. God's feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which lies before Jerusalem on the east. The mount will split, forming a valley by which the people will flee. With this plain description of the Mount of Olives being east of Jerusalem, it is evident that this is the Mount of Olives. However, it may be that this occurs not on the Mount of Olives proper, but on the southernmost peak of the entire range. Other points in the Old Testament may refer to the mount, even if it is not explicitly named. The first of these is 1 Kings 11:7, when Solomon turns from God and builds places on the mountain east of Jerusalem to worship foreign gods. Later in 2 Kings 23:13-14, King Josiah destroys Solomon's idolatrous constructions east of Jerusalem during his campaign to rid Jerusalem of apostasy. In Ezekiel 11:23, God announces his judgment on Israel for their unfaithfulness, while promising to bring them into a right relationship with him once again. In Ezekiel's vision, the glory of God ascends from the middle of the city and stood on the mountain. east of the city, and it is noteworthy that the glory of God does not go far but remains in a position of prominence over the city. And it is later in 43, 1 through 5, that his glory returns through the eastern gate from the direction of the Mount of Olives. And of course, we know that Jesus ascended up from the Mount of Olives in the glory cloud. In several episodes, the Mount of Olives is clearly the setting of the narrative. The first is the so-called triumphal entry. Jesus and the disciples approach Jerusalem and stop on the Mount of Olives, the mount which is called of olive trees in Luke 19:29, and they stop near the villages of Bethany and Bethpage. Bethany is known to have been on the eastern slope near the base. And this is kind of the area where the tombs were discovered of a lot of the disciples of Jesus. Though the location of Bethpage is still disputed, it is widely believed to be near Bethany on this slope. Jesus instructs them to go into the village to retrieve the colt on which Jesus rides into Jerusalem. John 12, 1 through 13 is a roughly parallel story to the synoptic account of the triumphal entry, which features Bethany, but the Mount of Olives is not explicitly mentioned. Jesus' teaching of the disciples about eschatological events after he tells them that the temple would be destroyed takes place here in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. And from the Mount of Olives, they would have been able to look on the Temple Mount and the surrounding area. And it also may have been inspired by the prophecy of Zechariah 14:4. Luke mentions after the discourse that Jesus was there every day and he was teaching in the temple. Indeed, since there were not many villages on the mount besides Bethany and Bethpage, the olive groves would be where many visitors would sleep, especially at Passover when Jerusalem's population more than tripled. Jesus' arrest by the officers of the high priest takes place on the Mount of Olives. And after their last meal together, Jesus and the disciples go out to the Mount of Olives. Only Matthew and Mark specify that they settle in a place called Gethsemane, which means oil press. At the base of the mount, facing Jerusalem once more, the parallel in John does not mention the mount explicitly, but says that after his discourses at the last meal, Jesus and the disciples go out across the valley of Kidron to a garden where he is arrested, because Gethsemane is directly across Kidron at the base of the Mount of Olives, and this is most likely the setting in all accounts. The last clear appearance of the Mount of Olives in the New Testament is the ascension of Messiah, narrated by Luke at the very end of his gospel in the beginning of Acts. In Luke 24, 50 through 53, after the resurrected Jesus has appeared to the disciples, he leads them out as far as Bethany, and while blessing them, he withdraws from them and is carried up into heaven. Jesus offers his final instructions to the disciples, and they then watch as he is lifted up and a cloud takes him out of their sight. And while they watch him go, two men dressed in white linen robes tell them that he will come again in the same way that they watched him go into heaven, implying that Jesus may return on the Mount of Olives. No indication is given of where this takes place until 1:12, which indicates that the disciples return to Jerusalem from literally the mount which is called Olive Grove. And Luke adds that this place is near Jerusalem, a Sabbath day journey away. And this is the length the law allowed travel on the Sabbath. The connection of the Mount of Olives with the departure and return of God's glory makes it suitable literally and theologically for the ascension and return of Jesus, Yeshua. And finally, the story of the woman caught in adultery may not be original to the Gospel of John, but many believe that it is based on real events. Little significance seemed to exist in the following story that Jesus had come from the mount, other than the fact that he would have already been close to the temple when he returns there and encounters the scribes, the Pharisees, and the woman. And the first is the cursing of the fig tree. This likely takes place on the mount as Jesus and the disciples make their way back to Jerusalem. Not finding any fruit on a fig tree when he's hungry, Jesus curses it that no fruit would ever come from it again. It withers, and Jesus takes the opportunity to teach the disciples about faith, telling them that even if they were to say to this mountain to be lifted and thrown into the sea, it would happen, if they were standing on it. And he may have been referring to the Mount of Olives, though it is said that he was speaking of the Temple Mount. The final text to be discussed does not feature the Mount of Olives as a setting, but Jesus may be alluding to it in Matthew 23:27 through 28, and here he criticizes the scribes and Pharisees for being like whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside but filthy on the inside. Jews were buried in tombs that sit on top of the ground on the lower western slope of the Mount of Olives, partially because burial is forbidden inside the city, but also probably because of the connection of the mount with end-time expectations. In Jewish tradition, holds that the olive leaf, which the dove returned to Noah with in Genesis 8:11, was from the Mount of Olives. And they have this from the Mishnah, Rob 33:6 and Para 3:6 through 7, indicates that the burning of the red heifer instituted for Israelite observance in Numbers 19:1 through 10, that was to be done outside the camp during the tabernacle period, was done on the Mount of Olives during the temple period. Jewish rabbinic tradition also holds that once the glory of God departed from the temple, in Ezekiel 11:23, it remained on the mount for 3.5 years, waiting for Israel to repent. Now, isn't that something? Because the first half of the tribulation is 3.5 years. And then he returns after the last 3.5 years. Eschatological expectation associated with the mount is seen in the tradition that it would be the place where the resurrection begins. The remains of faithful Jews who had been buried away from the city would travel through underground passageways to be raised on the mount. And this belief has led to many Jewish burials on the mount that continues to this day. And that's in one of their targums of the prophets in Zechariah 14:4 through 5. The Jerusalem area has long been settled, and sherd and vessel finds at the Dominus Flevit Franciscan Chapel on the western slope of the Mount of Olives, and that's the location where the ossuaries were found and where they are still housed today, of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, and Simeon the priest, and others and Simon Peter are still held in this chapel, but they're out of the sight of visitors. Sherds and vessel finds in this chapel on the western slope of the Mount of Olives attest to a continued settlement outside the city during the late Bronze Age. Many of these objects have been found to originate from Cyprus, the Aegean, and Egypt, which indicates foreign influences in the area. Many ossuaries have also been excavated at the Dominus Flevit site, some inscribed with biblical names such as Martha, Mary, Salome, Sapphira, Simeon the priest, Jonah, John, Joseph, and Zechariah. Significant archaeological finds have also been uncovered at the village of Bethany on the eastern slope. Excavations during 1951 through 53 unveiled coins, clay lamps, and other vessels from the time when Jesus would set foot in the village, and coins from the reigns of Herod the Great and Pontius Pilate. And in 1953, that is when they discovered the ossuary of Simon Peter. So it said Shimon bar Yonah. on the ossuary. And some of these ossuaries, they were Christian Jewish ossuaries, and they had crosses on them with the name Yeshua. Yeshua was the spelling from 2,000 years ago. And these are very significant discoveries that have been hushed up and hidden away so that the truth could not be told, and it's about time to tell this truth. So here I am telling it, and I'm hoping that people appreciate it, because where else are you going to hear this kind of information? And I'm trying to bring this forward. So the bottom line is the place where Jesus resurrected Lazarus is a different place than where he was eventually buried on the Mount of Olives, in this place, the Dominus Flevit Chapel. And that's where this chapel was built, over the spot. So that's where the ossuaries are, and they don't have it where you can see these ossuaries. So it's really hushed up. And very, very important archaeological discoveries. Some of the most incredible archaeological biblical discoveries ever. And I just want it to be known. If you'd like to subscribe to my channel, please do so. Please hit the like button. And if you want to donate to help this channel, which is really needed, it's paypal.me/KKROCOCO, and my mailing donation address is Kimberly K. Ballard, Ballard, P.O. Box 246, Niwot, which is Niwot, and then Colorado is CO 80544. And I also have an incredible testimony for the last days of King Yeshua that has a lot of miraculous and revelationary kind of stuff, details that were never known in the history of the world but came through the Holy Spirit for the days we're living in. And my book is available at olivepresspublisher.com. And when you go there, you can click on the banner that says The Almond Tree, Kimberly Ballard, and click on the book, click on the banner, and then there's a book that pops up. Click on that, and it'll open it up, and there's all kinds of descriptions and reviews and things. And my interview that I did, a radio interview with some pastor that I don't really know personally. So it's available on other online bookstores, and the book is actually physically made for you when you order it. So I pray that it would go out to the world and bless everyone. It's been printed and published worldwide. It's published in the U.S., in England, and in Australia. And any of those European locations, the book can be made there and shipped to you. So thank you so much. I will see you in the next video. Shalom for now.